On a Thursday morning in October of 1971, at the Stemple Farm equipment lot on Highway 6 in Harlan County, Nebraska, a 24-year-old farmer named Calvin Reese stood in the gravel parking lot holding a hydraulic pump, housing wrapped in an oil-stained rag, and waited for someone to stop laughing at him. He had driven the 12 miles from his farm in third gear, the whole way nursing the Oliver 88 because the hydraulic system had been failing for 3 days, and he did not want to lose steering on a county road. The pump housing had cracked along the mounting flange. Not a clean break, a jagged split that spread every time he ran the engine, weeping hydraulic fluid onto the barn floor in a slow red stain that had cost him 2 quarts this week alone. He had wrapped it in the rag to keep the crack from spreading on the drive over. He had not told Norma how bad it was because she would have worried, and there was enough to worry about already. Roy Stemple came out of the dealership at 7:45. He was 51 years old, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of hands that had once known hard work but had not known it recently. His flannel shirt was clean and pressed. His boots had not seen mud this season. He walked the way men walk when they own the building behind them and know it. He looked at the rag in Calvin's hands. He looked at Calvin. Then he unwrapped the pump housing and turned it over once in his palms. The crack was obvious. Roy set the housing on the hood of a display tractor and sucked air through his teeth. That is a precision casting, son. Gray iron. You crack that flange and you are not looking at a simple repair. You are looking at a replacement. Calvin asked how much. Roy did the math in his head without hurrying. New housing labor bleeding the system testing. You are looking at $340 give or take. Could have it done by Friday. Calvin had $18 in his wallet. He had maybe $200 in the account at Farmers State Bank in Alma, and $70 of that was already spoken for against a fuel delivery coming next week. $340 might as well have been $3,000. He stood there in the October wind, looking at the pump housing on the hood of a John Deere he would never be able to afford. Then he asked Roy how much for welding rod. Roy looked at him the way a man looks at someone who has said something both innocent and incorrect. Son, you cannot weld a gray iron casting. Not that crack. You heat gray iron wrong and it does not just crack again. It shatters. You would blow out the whole housing and take part of the hydraulic system with it. I have seen men try this. I have seen what comes after. You would be looking at $1,200 in damage minimum, trying to save $340. Calvin said he had some experience with cast iron. Roy picked up the housing and handed it back. Look, I am not trying to take your money. I am trying to save you from yourself. You weld that wrong and you are done for the season. Maybe done for longer than that. The sensible thing is to let my boys fix it right. We can work out a payment schedule if the total is a problem. Calvin looked at the housing in his hands. He looked at Roy. He asked again how much for welding rod. Roy was quiet for a moment. $5, maybe $6 for rod rated for cast iron. But you would be burning it. That is not a weld. That is a prayer. Calvin nodded. He thanked Roy for his time. He drove home in third gear. Roy Stemple stood in his parking lot and watched the Oliver 88 pull back onto Highway 6, trailing a faint smell of hot hydraulic fluid. He turned to his shop foreman and said something that the foreman would remember for the rest of his life. That kid is going to learn an expensive lesson. Some things cannot be fixed. Better to know it now than after you have made it worse. Let me tell you about Calvin Reese because to understand what he did next, you need to understand who he was and where he came from. Calvin was born in 1947, the second son of Harold and Bet Reese. The Reese farm was 140 acres of Harlan County ground, situated on a low rise about 4 miles south of Alma, where the Republican River drainage flattened out into fields that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The ground was not remarkable. It was not bottom land with deep black soil, not the kind that made headlines at auction. It was honest ground. It rewarded patience and punished shortcuts, and the Reese family had been working it that way for 2 generations. Harold Reese died in June of 1969. Heart attack sudden and complete in the middle of cultivating the North Field. Calvin was 22 years old. His older brother Dennis had already left for Omaha 3 years earlier, working a manufacturing job that paid better than farming and asked less of a man's body. His younger sister Ruth was 16 and still in school. That left Calvin. He did not think about it much. There was nothing to think about. The farm needed to be run, and he was the one who was there, so he ran it. He finished the cultivation that same week because the weeds did not care about grief, and neither did the calendar. He made every decision his father had made before him, and he made some of them wrong, and he learned from those, and he kept going. What Calvin had that most men his age did not was a specific and serious skill that he had never thought of as anything more than ordinary. Harold Reese had taught him to weld when he was 14 years old. They had stood together in the barn on a February morning with the wind pressing against the boards outside Harold, showing Calvin how to strike an arc, how to read the puddle, how to move the rod at the right angle and the right speed. Harold was not a trained welder. He had learned from a man named Werner Schaefer, a German immigrant who had run a blacksmith operation in Alma before the war and who had understood metal the way some men understand horses intuitively and completely. Harold taught Calvin what Werner had taught him, and Werner had been teaching what blacksmiths had known for 100 years before that. A broken machine is just a puzzle waiting to be solved. Calvin, the metal tells you what it needs. You just have to slow down enough to listen. By the time Calvin was 17, he was doing repairs Harold could not. Difficult angles, thin material, cast components that other farmers scrapped because no one would touch them. He had the hands for it, steady and patient with a precision that came from paying attention to small things over a long time. Harold called it the best kind of skill, the kind that looked like nothing until the moment you needed it, and then it looked like everything. Calvin did not meet Earl Vincent until the fall of 1970, almost a year after Harold died. Earl was 68 years old, retired, living alone on a small property 3 miles east of the Reese farm. He had spent 20 years as a machinist in the Navy, working on ship engines during Korea, and after learning a level of precision that farming communities in Nebraska almost never saw. He had come back to Harlan County because his wife had grown up there, and she had passed 7 years before Calvin met him, and Earl had stayed because he did not know where else to go. The first time Earl stopped at Calvin's farm, he did not say much. He had seen Calvin struggling with a seized bearing on the front axle of the Oliver 88, and he pulled off the county road without being asked, walked over and crouched down next to the axle without introducing himself. He looked at the problem for about 30 seconds. Then he went back to his truck and came back with a drift punch and a ball-peen hammer, and in 15 minutes the bearing was out. They did not talk about it. Earl handed Calvin back his tools and walked to his truck. Calvin called after him, "I appreciate that. What do I owe you?" Earl opened his truck door. "Pay attention to what I did, and you will not need me again." That was how it started. Over the following year, Earl came around maybe once a month. He never called ahead. He would appear when Calvin was working on something difficult, as if he had some way of knowing, and he would help without being asked and leave without ceremony. He brought Calvin a set of hand files one afternoon in the summer of 1971, setting them on the workbench without explanation. "Good tools do not need to be new," Earl said. "They need to be right." Calvin did not know it then, but those files would still be hanging on a wall 33 years later, with a card beside them that he would write himself. Now let me tell you about what happened in that barn in October of 1971, because that is where the real story begins. Calvin drove the Oliver 88 into the barn and shut off the engine and sat on the seat for a while without moving. He did the arithmetic in his head for the 4th time that day, and it came out the same as the first 3 times. He did not have $340. He was not going to have $340 for the hydraulic system failed completely, which at the current rate of cracking would be inside of 2 weeks. Without hydraulics, he could not run the loader. Without the loader, he could not move grain. The arithmetic ended the same every time he worked it. He unwrapped the pump housing and set it on his workbench under the trouble light. The crack ran along the mounting flange for about 3 inches, jagged on one end, cleaner on the other, where the metal had separated under consistent pressure rather than sudden impact. He had seen worse. He had seen cracks in gray iron that any reasonable man would have called unworkable. But gray iron was not like steel. It was harder, more brittle, and it did not forgive mistakes in heat or angle. Roy Stemple was not wrong about that. A bad weld on gray iron could make the crack worse. In the worst case, it could fracture the whole housing. The question was whether Roy Stemple knew the difference between a bad gray iron weld and a good one, or whether he only knew that most of them were bad. Calvin thought about what Harold had told him. He thought about Werner Schaefer and what Werner had known. He thought about the specific properties of gray iron and how it behaved when you respected those properties instead of ignoring them. Cast iron has memory, his father had said once watching Calvin repair a broken cultivator shank. It remembers where it broke. You have to convince it to forget. The technique for convincing it was not complicated, but it was slow and it demanded patience at every step. First, you ground out the crack into a V-groove so the weld had something to bond to, rather than just sitting on top of a hairline fracture. Then you preheated the entire casting, not just the crack, but the whole piece, raising the temperature slowly and evenly to around 400 degrees so the metal expanded uniformly and would contract uniformly when it cooled. Then you welded with nickel iron rod, not standard steel rod, because nickel iron had the flexibility to absorb the stress that gray iron could not. You welded in short passes, peening each one while it was still warm to release the internal stress. Then you wrapped the whole piece in insulating material and let it cool for 12 hours. No shortcuts on the cooling. The shortcuts were where men lost the work. Calvin drove to the hardware store in Alma that afternoon and spent $5.60 on nickel iron rod and a grinding wheel. He spent another $1.40 at the farm supply on a new pair of welding gloves because his old ones had worn through on the right palm. $7 even. He worked through Thursday night and all of Friday. The grinding took 2 hours. The preheating took 90 minutes with a propane torch moving it constantly to keep the heat distributed. He checked the temperature with a stick of thermal crayon Harold had left in the shop drawer, the kind that melts at a known temperature and tells you when you have reached it. The welding itself took 4 hours. Short passes peening, short passes peening. He did not rush any of it. When the last pass was done, he wrapped the housing in the horse blanket he used for the same purpose Harold had used it for, laid it on the concrete floor away from any draft, and went to bed. Saturday morning he unwrapped it and ground the weld smooth with a hand file from Earl's set. He measured the flange with calipers to check that the heat had not warped it out of tolerance. It had not. He ran a bead of hydraulic sealant along the mating surface and bolted the housing back onto the Oliver 88. He bled the system. He started the engine and let it idle for an hour while he stood next to it and watched the flange for any sign of seeping fluid. Nothing. He drove the tractor around the barnyard. He worked the loader arm through its full range of motion. He drove out to the north field and back. The hydraulic system held pressure across every cycle. The $7 weld was holding. Norma came out of his house with 2 cups of coffee and stood next to him, watching the tractor idle. She had not asked him what he was going to do when he came home from Stemple's without getting the repair done. She had known he was going to figure something out because that was the only thing she had ever seen him do. She handed him the coffee. "How long do you think it will last?" Calvin wrapped both hands around the cup. "I do not know." "Long enough." She nodded. She went back inside. "Let me tell you about what happened next, because that is when the world outside the Reese farm started to pay attention." By the following Wednesday, word had reached the feed store on 3rd Street in Alma that Calvin Reese had welded his own hydraulic pump housing and that the repair had held. In a county where most farm news traveled by who stood next to whom at the co-op or who sat at which table at the diner, that was fast. Some men were skeptical. Roy Stemple heard it by Thursday and told his shop foreman the same thing he had told him the week before, that the boy was going to learn a harder lesson when it failed under load. But it did not fail under load. The Oliver 88 worked through the rest of the fall without a problem. In February of 1972, Calvin's neighbor to the east, a 60-year-old corn farmer named Ed Harker, appeared at the Reese barn with a cracked transmission housing from his Alice Chalmers D17. He had taken it to a shop in Hastings, and they had quoted him $890 for a replacement housing, plus labor. Ed had farmed that ground for 35 years, and he had never paid $890 for a single repair in his life. He asked Calvin if he would look at it. Calvin looked at it for 10 minutes. It was a harder crack than the pump housing running through a section of the casting that carried significant load, but it was workable. He told Ed what he needed for materials and what he thought it would take in time, and he named a number for labor that Ed immediately said was too low. Calvin said it was what he wanted to charge, and they could discuss it after the repair held or did not hold. The repair held. Total cost to Ed Harker, $45 in materials, $30 in labor. $75 against an $890 dealer quote. Ed drove home with his transmission housing and told everyone he knew. That spring, a farmer from the south end of the county brought a cracked axle housing. Then a man from over near Stamford brought a broken hydraulic cylinder that two shops had refused to touch. Calvin fixed the axle housing. He fixed the cylinder. He began keeping a record of every repair in a small notebook Norma had given him the previous fall, a blue-covered composition book that had been sitting empty in the kitchen drawer. He wrote down the date, the part, the material cost, what he charged, in a single line about what the repair involved. The first entry was October 1971. Hydraulic pump housing, gray iron flange crack, nickel iron rod, 4 hours. Materials, $5.60. Labor, zero. Dealer quote, $340. He had not charged Ed Harker nothing. He was learning to charge something, not much, enough to cover materials with a small margin. These were his neighbors, men as careful with money as he was. He was not trying to build a business. He was trying to help people fix what they could not afford to replace. But a third farmer was already on his way to the Reese barn with a seized power steering pump, and a fourth had left a message with Norma about a broken implement hitch. And Calvin was beginning to understand that what he had done with that $7 weld was not just save his own season. He had given people in Harlan County somewhere to go with the things that everyone else told them to throw away. Lyle Bauer lived a mile and a half north of the Reese farm. He was 30 years old, earnest and direct in the way of men who grew up in small counties and never learned to be otherwise. He had watched 3 neighbors bring equipment to Calvin and drive home with it repaired, and one afternoon in the early summer of 1972, he drove over and stood in the barn doorway while Calvin worked, watching without saying anything for about 10 minutes. Then he asked the question he had been turning over for a while. How do you know which ones can actually be fixed? Calvin did not look up from the weld. You do not until you try. He set the rod down and turned off the torch. Most people do not try. They hear a dealer say it is not worth fixing, and they believe it because the dealer sounds like he knows what he is talking about. Sometimes the dealer is right, but a lot of the time he is looking at it from the wrong direction. He is looking at what it would cost him to fix it. I am looking at whether the metal will let me. Lyle thought about that for a moment. What if the metal will not let you? Then I tell them that, and I do not charge them for the time. Lyle nodded slowly. He drove home and told his wife that the Reese kid might be onto something. Roy Stemple heard different versions of the same story through 1972 and into 1973, each one adding another repair that should not have worked but had. He was not a man who dismissed information. He had been in the equipment business long enough to know that sometimes you saw something you had been certain was impossible, and the honest response was to update what you knew. He drove out to the Reese farm one afternoon in the fall of 1973 and looked at the Oliver 88 from the county road without stopping. 2 years and the machine was still running. He drove back to Alma and said nothing to anyone, but he thought about it on the way. What he did not think about, what Roy Stemple could not have been expected to think about in the fall of 1973, was where the next 10 years were going to take the farming economy of the entire state of Nebraska, and what that would mean for men who owed money and men who did not. The early 1970s had been good years for farmers across the Great Plains. The Soviet grain deal of 1972 had sent corn prices from under $1.50 a bushel to over $3, and the rush of cash had pushed land values up by 15 to 20% annually. Banks had followed the money the way they always do, offering operating loans and equipment loans and land loans at terms that looked reasonable when commodity prices were high and looked very different when they were not. By 1975, Nebraska farmers were carrying more than $8 billion in total agricultural debt, nearly double what it had been at the start of the decade. Roy Stemple sold more equipment in those 5 years than he had in the previous 15. New John Deeres went off his lot every week, financed on 5-year notes that his customers signed because Roy told them that modern equipment was an investment, and the numbers proved it. Calvin Reese bought nothing on credit in those years. He made his repairs. He kept his notebook. He farmed his 140 acres with the Oliver 88 and a second-hand disc he had bought at a farm sale for $300 cash in the spring of 1972. He watched his neighbors expand. He watched the land prices and said nothing. Norma asked him once if he wanted to look at something newer, something with a PM air conditioning. The Oliver had no cab. In July it was brutal, and in October it was cold, and in April the wind off the Republican River Valley cut through everything a man could wear. Calvin thought about it for a moment. Then he said that new equipment was for men who could afford to break it. She understood what he meant. By the spring of 1974, Calvin had completed 22 repairs for 11 different farmers. Total materials cost out of his own pocket $312. Total he had charged $460. $148 in margin above materials, representing roughly his labor across all of it. The dealers had quoted for those same 22 repairs a combined total of somewhere between $6,000 and $8,000 based on the quotes his customers had brought him. He wrote the comparison in the notebook, not to show anyone, just because the numbers told a story he thought was worth keeping. Let me tell you about the years between 1974 and 1982, because that is where Calvin Reese built everything that mattered, one repair at a time, while the world around him was building something very different. The work came steadily after Ed Harker spread the word. Not a flood, not more than Calvin could handle alongside the farming, but a consistent stream of men arriving at the barn with equipment that dealers had written off or quoted at prices that made no sense for a farm running on thin margins. Calvin fixed what he could fix and told people honestly when he could not. He never lost a piece of equipment to a repair gone wrong. He came close twice, once with a cast differential housing that fractured further during preheat before he could get the weld in, and once with a hydraulic cylinder rod so corroded that the metal crumbled at the first pass. Both times he told the farmer, straight-handed back the parts, and charged nothing. The notebook filled slowly. 1974 was a good year on the farm. Corn made 112 bushels to the acre on the home ground, a touch above county average, and the price held above $2 through harvest. Calvin's repair income for the year came to $420 after materials. He spent $180 of it on a used arc welder to replace the older one Harold had bought secondhand in 1961, a Lincoln Tombstone-style machine that he found at an estate sale near Oxford and drove home in the bed of his truck. He paid for it with cash from the notebook money. The old welder went onto a shelf in case he needed parts. Earl Vincent came around less frequently now. Not because the friendship had cooled, but because there was less for Earl to show him. Calvin had absorbed most of what Earl knew that applied to farm repair work, and both men understood this without saying it. Earl would stop by on a Tuesday afternoon and sit on an overturned bucket while Calvin worked, and they would talk about equipment or weather or the way certain problems repeated themselves across different machines, and then Earl would drive home. It was the comfortable quiet of two men who did not need conversation to justify being in the same place. In the spring of 1975, Earl told Calvin his heart was giving him trouble. Not in those words exactly. He said the doctor in Hastings had told him to slow down, and that he had told the doctor he was 63 years old and already retired and did not know what slower would look like. He was not afraid. He talked about it the way he talked about a seized bearing as a mechanical problem that had a foreseeable endpoint. Calvin did not say much. There was not much to say. 1975 was the year Roy Stemple sold the most equipment he had ever moved in a single calendar year. New John Deeres went off his lot in March and April and May as farmers used their operating loans to upgrade before planting. Calvin drove past the dealership on a Tuesday in April and counted 7 new machines on the lot, each one bright green and yellow, each one representing a note at the bank that would come due over 5 years. He drove on without stopping. His own debt position in 1975 was zero. He had no operating loan, no equipment note, no land debt. He farmed 140 acres with a 15-year-old tractor and a second-hand disc, and what he grew was his. 1976 brought a dry summer. The corn on the Reese ground made 78 bushels to the acre against a county average closer to 95. Calvin netted $4,000 from the crop after inputs. The repair income that year ran to $610, and it was the repair money that kept the year from being tight. He wrote in the notebook 1976, drought year, corn light, repair income carried the margin. Zero debt meant the drought was a setback, not a crisis. He had watched 2 neighbors that year talk to their banks about restructuring operating loans because the yield had not covered the payment. Both of them farmed more acres than Calvin with newer equipment. He felt for them and said nothing useful because there was nothing useful to say. Father's voice flashback. Uninvited the way those things always arrived, Harold standing in the kitchen doorway on a dry August evening in 1965, looking at a sky that had not given rain in 3 weeks. His voice quiet and certain. The year the rain quits on you is the year you find out what you actually own. Calvin had been 18 years old. He had not understood it then the way he understood it now. Earl Vinson died in March of 1978. It was a Monday early morning before the ground had warmed enough to call it spring. Calvin heard from Earl's neighbor that Earl had not come out for his newspaper 2 days running, and the neighbor had gone over and found him in his chair by the window, gone peacefully in the night sometime the previous week. Calvin drove over that afternoon and sat in Earl's driveway for a while before going inside to help the neighbors sort through what needed sorting. He took nothing from the house except what Earl had told him 2 years earlier. He was welcome to take a set of machinist's parallels, a surface plate the size of a cutting board, and a box of specialty tooling that Calvin had admired once, and Earl had said would do him more good than gathering dust. He loaded them into his truck carefully and drove home. That evening he went into the barn and stood for a while without turning on the trouble light. He thought about Werner Schaefer teaching Harold, Harold teaching him, Earl showing up uninvited on a county road and crouching next to an axle without being asked. He thought about how a skill moves through people across time, each one carrying it forward to the next, and how most of that carrying happens without anyone naming it or making a ceremony of it. He turned on the light and went back to work. Let me tell you about 1979 and what it meant for farming in Nebraska, because you need to understand what was coming before you can understand what it looked like when it arrived. In the fall of 1979, the Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker began raising interest rates to break the inflation that had been grinding through the American economy for most of the decade. The prime rate had been 9% in 1978. By June of 1981, it had reached 21.5%. For a farmer who had borrowed at variable rates during the boom years of the mid-70s, this was not an adjustment. It was a wall. Nebraska land values had peaked in 1981, driven up by a decade of optimism and easy credit, with some prime ground in the eastern part of the state trading above $2,000 an acre. By 1984, that same ground would be worth 40% less. By 1986, it would be worth less than half its peak value in some counties. The Federal Land Bank of Omaha reported losses that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. The Farm Credit System, which had financed a generation of expansion across the Great Plains, was hemorrhaging billions. In Harlan County, 8 farms went through foreclosure in 1983 alone. Men who had farmed the same ground their fathers had farmed, who had borrowed to buy equipment and expand acreage when the banks were encouraging it, who had done everything the system told them to do and had done it in good faith, were losing everything. Calvin Reese had no variable rate debt in 1979 because Calvin Reese had no debt of any kind. He watched what was happening with the same careful attention he brought to everything, and he kept his notebook. In the fall of 1981, a 40-acre parcel adjacent to his north fence line came up for sale. The owner, a man named Gus Treadwell, who had farmed it alone since his wife died and was now moving to his daughter's place in Grand Island, priced it at $28,000. This was below market value even as the market was beginning to turn, and Gus wanted a cash sale, no bank close in 30 days. Calvin had been putting aside repair income and farm profit for 10 years. He drove to Alma, withdrew $28,000 from Farmers State Bank, and bought the ground. The deed went into the file cabinet in the farmhouse office where Harold's deed had been. He wrote one line in the notebook that evening: 40 acres, cash, no bank. Total farm now 180 acres. Lyle Bauer, who had heard about the sale before Calvin got home, drove over that evening and sat at the kitchen table with Calvin and Norma and asked how a man who farmed with a 15-year-old tractor had $28,000 sitting in a bank account. Calvin poured him a cup of coffee. Same way you get anywhere, Lyle. You spend less than you make for long enough. Lyle looked at the coffee. That's simple, Calvin thought about it. The simple things are usually the hardest ones to do for 20 years straight. By the spring of 1982, the repair work had become a second operation in everything but name. Calvin had completed 127 repairs since 1971. He had charged a total of $2,840 for all of it, materials and labor combined. He had collected his customers' dealer quotes where they had them, and he had estimated where they did not, and the total for the same work at dealership rates came to somewhere north of $34,000. He wrote that comparison in the notebook and underlined it. Not with anger, just because it was true and true things were worth writing down. The cost comparison told a story that had nothing to do with Calvin Reese being clever and everything to do with what happened when you stopped believing that repair was an inferior option to replacement. The difference between $34,000 and $2,800 spread across 11 years was the difference between debt and no debt for a lot of the men who had brought him their broken parts. He had not saved them. They had saved themselves by coming to him instead of going to the bank. He had just given them a place to bring the things that everyone else said to throw away. Let me tell you about 1984 because that is when the wheel came full circle. The Harlan County Equipment Cooperative held an auction on the third Saturday of April 1984 on the grounds of the sale barn south of Alma. It was not a cheerful event. 3 farms represented in the equipment lineup had gone through foreclosure the previous year, and everyone who walked onto those grounds understood that what they were looking at was the physical residue of men's working lives being sold off because the numbers had stopped working. Calvin and Norma drove over together. They did not talk much on the way. Norma wore her good coat because the April wind off the river was still cold, and she held her coffee in both hands while they walked the equipment line before the auction started. Calvin looked at everything slowly and said nothing. Lyle Bauer found them near the line of tractors. He looked at a row of John Deeres in various states of use, all of them consigned by farmers who could no longer make the payments, and he said to Calvin what a lot of people were thinking but not saying out loud. These were good machines. Calvin looked at the nearest one, a 402 with a cracked side panel and mud dried in the cooling fins. Yes, he said, they were. The auctioneer started at 9 o'clock. The early lots moved fast because they were small tillage implements and hand tools and shop equipment that went for fractions of their value to men who were watching their own situations carefully and would only bid what they could afford to carry home and use. Then the tractors. A 4020 that Roy Stemple had sold to a farmer named Tom Aldrich in the spring of 1978 came up as Lot 47. Calvin knew the machine. He had seen it at the co-op and at the elevator over the years, a clean machine that Aldrich had maintained well until the last 2 seasons, when maintaining anything had become a lower priority than meeting the bank. Roy Stemple had sold it new for $22,000. Aldrich had financed it over 5 years at terms that had looked manageable in 1978 and had not looked that way since 1981. The auctioneer opened at $4,000. Silence. Not the pause before bidding silence. The silence of men who did not have $4,000 liquid and knew it. $3,500. One hand went up, then dropped when no one matched it. $3,200. Calvin raised his hand. The auctioneer looked at him. He knew Calvin the way auctioneers know everyone in a county after 20 years of sales. $3,200, he said. Do I have 33? The man who had raised his hand at 35 looked at Calvin, then shook his head. Sold. To Calvin Reese. $3,200. The auctioneer moved on. The crowd did not move on quite as quickly. There was a murmur low and specific, the kind that carries information. People in Harlan County knew that Calvin Reese farmed 180 acres with an old tractor and ran repairs out of his barn. They did not know, most of them, that he had $28,000 in cash available to buy land in 1981. But they understood, watching him fold the bid receipt and put it in his shirt pocket, that the man who had declined to buy new equipment for 13 years had just bought a 2-year-old John Deere 402 for less than 15 cents on the dollar in cash, while the man who had bought it new on credit had lost it to the bank. Roy Stemple was standing 40 feet away. He had been working the auction on the margins, talking to the bank representative who was overseeing the consignment lots, watching the prices and doing his own arithmetic about what the farm crisis was costing everyone who had bought from him on credit. He had not intended to watch Calvin Reese buy one of his machines for $3,200. He had watched it anyway. The auctioneer's hammer came down. The sound was a single flat crack that carried across the sale barn grounds and then was gone. Roy Stemple stood absolutely still. His face did not change. His arms, which had been crossed at his chest the way they always were when he was thinking, dropped to his sides. He was looking at the 4020, then at Calvin, then at the 4020 again, and for a long moment he did not look like Roy Stemple, the man who had been selling equipment in Harlan County for 25 years and knew the business from every angle. He looked like a man doing arithmetic that was not coming out the way he expected. He did not say anything. He turned and walked to his truck and sat in it for the remainder of the auction. Lyle Bauer appeared at Calvin's elbow while the next lot was going up. He kept his voice low. Did you just buy Tom Aldrich's tractor for $3,200? Calvin tucked the receipt into his notebook. Yes, Lyle looked at the 4020. What are you going to do with it? Fix it, Calvin said. And sell it. Lyle stood there for a moment. For how much Calvin looked at the machine, estimating in the practiced way he had been estimating for 13 years. Maybe 8,500, if the engine is what I think it is. Lyle did the math slowly and out loud the way a man does when the numbers are surprising him. You bought a $22,000 tractor for $3,200 and you expect to sell it for $8,500. Calvin nodded. After repairs. Lyle looked at him. How long have you been doing this? Calvin thought about it. Since October of 1971. The first time. Before that, I just fixed things for neighbors. 2 weeks after the auction, a car turned into Calvin's driveway on a Tuesday afternoon, moving slowly over the gravel the way cars move when the driver is looking at something unfamiliar. A man in a tie stepped out. In Harlan County in 1984, a man in a tie arriving at a farm without calling ahead meant something specific, and Calvin set down his wrench and stood up straight and waited. The man was Dwight Castle, loan officer at Harlan County Bank. He was 44 years old with the careful posture of someone who delivered difficult news for a living and had learned to wear his face neutral while he did it. He explained that he was visiting a number of operations in the county and that the bank was making assessments of the local agricultural situation. He said it the way bank people said things in language that meant several things at once and committed to none of them. Calvin asked him directly if the bank was calling loans. Castle said that they were reviewing their portfolio. Calvin told him he was welcome to review whatever he liked, but that the only account he held at Harlan County Bank was a savings account that had no loan attached to it. Castle looked at his papers. He confirmed this. He stood in the driveway for a moment longer than he needed to, looking at the barn, looking at the 4020 sitting in the yard with its side panel off. Then he looked at Calvin with an expression that was not quite professional neutrality. You are the only farmer I have visited this month who did not ask me whether the bank was going to be reasonable. Calvin said he supposed that was because he did not need the bank to be reasonable. Castle nodded slowly, got back in his car, and drove out the way he had come. Norma had watched from the kitchen window. When Calvin came inside, she asked who it was. He told her. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, your father would have enjoyed today. Calvin thought about that. He thought about Harold buying a used Farmall in 1952 with money he had saved for 3 years and driving it home without owing a cent on it and farming with it for 17 years before Calvin took over. He thought about what Harold had said about owing no man anything and intending to die that way. He picked up his coffee. Yes, he said, I think he would have. Roy Stemple drove out to the Reese farm on a Tuesday morning in June of 1984. He came alone. No shop foreman, no salesman riding along, no reason given in advance. Calvin heard the truck on the gravel and looked up from the 4020, which he had been working on for 3 weeks by then, and recognized the vehicle before he recognized the man inside it. Roy stepped down from the cab and stood for a moment looking at the barn, then at the yard, then at the 4020 with its engine partially disassembled on a piece of clean plywood Calvin had laid out to keep the parts organized. Roy had the look of a man who had decided to do something difficult and was still deciding exactly how to do it. Calvin set down the wrench he was holding and waited. Roy walked over and stood across the plywood from him, looking at the parts laid out in sequence. He was 64 years old now, and the last 2 years had done something to him that the previous 20 had not. He was still broad across the shoulders, but he stood differently without the particular confidence of a man who owns the building behind him and knows it. He looked at the 4020, still working on it. Nearly done. Calvin wiped his hands on a shop rag. Engine needed more than I thought. The previous owner had been running it a quart low on oil for most of the last season. Scored 1-cylinder wall. Roy looked at the cylinder head sitting on the plywood. What did that cost you? Sleeve kit from a supplier in Omaha. $62. Calvin had done the machining himself using Earl's surface plate and a boring bar he had bought at an estate sale in 1979. He had bored and honed the sleeve himself in the barn over 2 days. Roy was quiet for a moment. He looked at the Oliver 88 parked along the south wall of the barn. The tractor was 32 years old. The green paint had faded and in some places worn through to bare metal, and the seat had been recovered twice, but the engine sat level and clean, and everything that was supposed to move, moved correctly. Still running, Roy said. It was not quite a question. Still running. Roy nodded slowly. He had said those same words to his shop foreman in 1971, standing in his parking lot watching the Oliver pull back onto Highway 6. That well won't last, he had said. A month, maybe a year, 13 years. He looked at the ground for a moment. Then he looked at Calvin directly the way men look at each other when they are done with the conversation around the edges and ready for the one in the middle. I have been in this business 25 years, Roy said. I have sold equipment to nearly every farmer in this county at one time or another. A lot of them are gone now. He paused. Not gone from the county, gone from farming. The Hendersons, the Pollock's art operation, Tom Aldrich, men who bought good equipment on reasonable terms when the terms made sense, and then the terms stopped making sense, and the equipment got repossessed, and now somebody else is farming their ground. Calvin said nothing. Roy looked at the 4020. I sold that machine for $22,000. Calvin bought it for $3,200. I know, Calvin said. I was there. Roy almost smiled. Something moved across his face that might have been the beginning of a smile and then settled into something more complicated. He said, I came out here because I have been wanting to say something to you for about 2 years, and I kept not saying it, and I am getting old enough that I have stopped having patience for things I keep not doing. Calvin waited. Roy said I was wrong about the pump housing. I was wrong about the Oliver. I was wrong about what you were doing out here all those years, and I am not sure I was right about much of what I told the rest of this county either, even when I believed it completely. Calvin looked at him. He thought about standing in Roy's parking lot in 1971 with $18 in his wallet and a cracked housing in a rag. He thought about Roy's laugh, which had not been a mean laugh, just the laugh of a man who was certain. He thought about certainty and what it cost when it was wrong. He said, you were not wrong about everything, Roy. You were right that most men cannot weld gray iron. You were right that a bad repair makes things worse. You just did not know that I had learned to do it right. Roy looked at him. I should have asked. Calvin nodded. You gave me something instead. He paused, finding the words. You gave me a reason to prove it. I went home from your parking lot angry enough to work through 2 nights, and that anger made me careful, and the careful work held. He looked at the Oliver. 13 years and counting. Roy was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that has weight in it. Then he said, what did you charge for that pump housing? Nothing. First one was on me. Roy shook his head slowly. He looked at the notebook sitting on the workbench, its blue cover soft with handling. He said, I have heard about the notebook. Calvin picked it up and opened it to the comparison page he had written in the spring of 1982. He set it on the hood of the 4020 without saying anything. Roy read it. He read it the way men read things that matter, without hurrying, going back to the beginning when he reached the end. 127 repairs, $2,840 total. Dealer quotes for the same work, $34,000 and change. He set the notebook back down. He did not say anything for a while. Then he said the ground was never the problem, was it? Calvin looked at him. Roy said I spent 25 years telling farmers that their equipment was the problem. Too old, too slow, not efficient enough. Buy new, finance it, upgrade again in 5 years. He paused. The equipment was never the problem. The debt was. Calvin felt something shift in the air between them. Not triumph. Something quieter than that. He said, you were not wrong about new equipment, Roy. You were wrong about who it was for. New equipment is for men who can afford to break it. Every farmer I have fixed for in 13 years could not afford to break anything. They needed what they had to keep working. That is a different problem than the one you were selling a solution to. Roy looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his keys from where he had set them on the fender of the 4020. He said, if you ever need anything from my end part sourcing supplier contacts, anything you call me. He said it simply without ceremony. Calvin said he would. Roy drove back down the gravel lane and turned onto the county road toward Alma. Calvin watched the truck until it was out of sight. Then he picked up the wrench and went back to the 4020. He had the machine running by the following Friday. He sold it in August to a farmer near Riverton for $8,200. He wrote the numbers in the notebook. Purchase $3,200, repairs $214, sold 8,200. He underlined the margin without comment. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because that is where the real measure of a man's work shows itself, not in the single moment when something turns, but in what he builds during all the ordinary time on either side of it. Stemple Farm Equipment closed in the spring of 1988. Roy had held on longer than most, but the farm crisis had taken too many of his customers and left too much repossessed inventory sitting on his lot. And the bank that had financed his own floor plan was no longer willing to extend terms that had made sense in a different era. The John Deere sign came down on a Wednesday in March. Roy's shop foreman, a man named Gerald Pruitt, who had worked there for 19 years, stood in the parking lot and watched the sign crew take it apart and did not say anything because there was nothing to say. Roy retired to a smaller house in Alma. His daughter lived in Hastings and came on weekends. He was not bitter about what had happened, or if he was, he did not show it. He had made his choices in good faith with the information he had, and the information had been wrong in ways that the entire agricultural lending system had also been wrong, and he was not the only man in Nebraska who had found himself on the wrong side of that. Calvin heard that Roy had retired and drove into Alma one afternoon to see him. They sat on Roy's porch and drank coffee and talked about equipment and farming and the way counties change over 20 years, and Roy asked how the repair work was going, and Calvin told him it was busier than ever because the crisis had left a lot of farmers with machines they could not afford to replace and needed to keep running. Roy nodded. He said that was probably the most honest business in Harlan County right now. In the fall of 1989, Calvin added 20 acres on the south end of his property when a parcel came available at a distressed price. Total farm 200 acres, all of it debt-free. He wrote the number in the notebook, which was on its third volume by then, and set it back on the shelf where it lived between the welding manuals and the machinist's handbook Earl had given him in 1977. Norma suggested the Tuesday class in the spring of 1991. She said it's simply the way she said most things without buildup. You know things that people around here need to know, and you are not teaching them to anyone except the ones who come through the barn already needing a repair. Calvin thought about Earl appearing uninvited on a county road because he had seen someone struggling and knew how to help. He thought about Harold standing in the barn on a February morning showing a 14-year-old boy how to strike an arc. He started the class in April. Tuesday evenings, 6 to 8 in the barn. Free. He covered basic welding first, then cast iron specifically, then hydraulic system maintenance, then the particular challenges of keeping older equipment running in a county where the dealer was gone and the nearest John Deere shop was in Hastings. 6 people came to the first session. By fall, there were 11 regulars. Some of them were young farmers in their 20s trying to figure out how to farm without drowning in equipment debt. Some were older men who had always fixed things themselves and wanted to learn the cast iron techniques they had never been taught. Roy Stemple came on a Thursday evening in October of 1992, not a Tuesday. He knocked on the barn door and asked if he could sit in. Calvin told him Tuesday was the regular night. Roy said he knew, but he had driven out anyway and would understand if it was not convenient. Calvin told him to find a bucket and sit down. Roy sat in the back for 2 hours and did not say anything. At the end, when the others were leaving, he walked to the front and stood next to Calvin for a moment. He said, "You were teaching this whole time, even in 1971 when you drove home with $5.60 in welding rod and a housing everyone said could not be fixed. You were teaching even then that it could be done." Calvin said he had just been trying to keep his hydraulics working. Roy said that is the same thing. He shook Calvin's hand and drove home. The Tuesday class ran for 11 years. In that time, Calvin taught basic and intermediate welding skills to 63 people. He tracked them loosely the way he tracked everything in a notebook. Of the 63, at least 14 had used what they learned to keep equipment running that would otherwise have required replacement at costs their operations could not have absorbed. He did not claim credit for this. He wrote the number down because numbers told the truth, and the truth was worth keeping. The brace of hand files Earl Vincent had brought to the Reese barn in the summer of 1971 hung on the south wall of the workshop by 1995, mounted on a piece of oak that Calvin had shaped and sanded on a winter evening. Below them, he had tacked a card in his own handwriting. Earl Vincent, 1903 to 1978. Good tools do not need to be new. They need to be right. Visitors to the barn asked about the card sometimes. Calvin told them the short version that Earl was a machinist who had known more about metal than anyone else he had ever met, and that the files still worked better than anything he had bought new. The Oliver 88 ran until 2004. 33 years from the day Calvin nursed it home from Roy Stemple's parking lot with the hydraulic system failing and the future entirely unclear. It did not stop running because the engine gave out. It stopped because Calvin retired the machine, deliberately parking it along the south wall of the barn in the spot it had occupied for most of its working life, on the grounds that a machine that had worked that long and that faithfully deserved to stop on its own terms rather than someone else's. He parked it on a Saturday afternoon in April, which was the same month he had bought the Aldrich tractor at auction 20 years earlier, and he stood next to it for a while with his hand on the fender, the way you stand next to something you have known for a long time. He thought about Harold buying it used in 1952. He thought about the morning in October of 1971 when he had nursed it those 12 miles to Alma and back with $18 in his wallet and no plan except to try. He thought about a broken machine being a puzzle waiting to be solved, and about metal that remembers where it broke, and about a set of hand files on a wall, and a man who had stopped on a county road because someone was struggling and he knew how to help. He said nothing out loud. He turned off the trouble light and went inside. Let me tell you about Marcus, because the story does not end in 2004, and it was never only about one man. Marcus Reese was 28 years old in 2004 and had been back in Harlan County for 2 years, having finished an engineering degree at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, and then spent a year in Omaha deciding that what he wanted to do was what his father did in the place his father did it. Calvin had not pushed him in either direction. He had answered questions when Marcus asked them, and otherwise let his son find his own way to the same ground. In the late summer of 2004, a farmer named Bill Decker drove over from near Arapahoe with a problem he had already taken to 2 shops in the region. His John Deere 7700 combine had a cracked feeder house casting a heavy gray iron component that ran the crop flow from the header into the machine, and the dealers who had looked at it had quoted him $4,200 for a replacement casting plus labor. Decker could not spend $4,200 on a combine repair in a season that had already been difficult. Marcus looked at the casting. He turned it over in his hands the way Calvin had taught him, reading the crack, tracing the stress lines to understand where the fracture had started and why. He asked Calvin if he had ever repaired one of these. Calvin said the feeder house casting was a harder job than a pump housing because the section thickness varied and the loading was more complex, but that the principle was the same. The principle was always the same. Marcus repaired the casting over 3 days. He preheated it the way Calvin had learned from Harold, and Harold had learned from Werner Schaefer in the slow, patient way that gray iron required. He used nickel iron rod. He peened each pass. He let it cool wrapped in the horse blanket that had served the same purpose since before Calvin could remember. He measured the finished weld with calipers and found it within tolerance. He charged Bill Decker $95 for materials and labor. Decker drove home and ran the combine through harvest without a problem. He told the story at the elevator in Arapahoe, and then at a meeting of the County Farm Bureau, and 2 more farmers called the Reese barn before the end of October. Calvin had watched Marcus work through most of the 3 days, not instructing, just present the way Earl had been present in the barn in those early years, sitting on an overturned bucket and saying almost nothing. On the 3rd evening, when Marcus was finishing the final grinding, Calvin stood up and went to the workbench and opened the original blue notebook, the first one now soft and dark with 20 years of handling. He turned to the first entry. October 1971. Hydraulic pump housing, gray iron flange, crack nickel iron rod, 4 hours. Materials, $5.60. Labor, 0. Dealer quote, $340. He set the notebook on the workbench where Marcus could see it when he came over. He did not say anything about it. He went inside. Marcus found it 20 minutes later. He stood in the barn under the trouble light and read the first page, then the second, then kept reading. He read for a long time. Calvin could see the barn light from the kitchen window and knew what his son was doing, and he let him do it. That winter, Calvin transferred the deed to Reese Welding and the farm property to Marcus. Not a gift exactly. An arrangement they had discussed over several months with Calvin, staying on in the farmhouse and working when he felt like it and stepping back from the rest. He handed Marcus the keys to the barn, in the workshop, in the notebook, all 3 volumes of it, and said, Your grandfather's rule: never owe any man anything. Marcus held the keys. He looked at the barn. He said, what was the second rule? Calvin thought about Harold in the barn, on a February morning cold coming through the boards, showing a 14-year-old boy how to hold the rod. He thought about Werner Schaefer and what Werner had taught Harold, and Earl Vinson stopping on a county road to help someone he did not know, and a set of hand files on a wall with a card that told the truth. He said, slow down enough to listen. The metal tells you what it needs. Marcus nodded. He put the keys in his pocket and walked out to open the barn. Reese Welding operates in Harlan County, Nebraska to this day. Marcus Reese runs it from the same barn his grandfather built, with the same surface plate Earl Vinson used, with the hand files still hanging on the south wall under the card. The Tuesday class became a Thursday class under Marcus, then expanded to twice a month when the demand outgrew one evening. The Oliver 88 stands along the south wall where Calvin parked it in April of 2004. It will not be scrapped. It will not be sold. It is there because some things earn the right to stay. Calvin Reese died in 2017 at the age of 70. He had farmed his ground and run his shop for 46 years without owing a bank anything on either one. The church in Alma held more people than it was designed to hold on the day of the funeral, and the overflow stood in the parking lot with the doors open listening. Farmers drove from 3 counties, men whose equipment Calvin had kept running through years when losing the equipment would have meant losing the farm. Men who had sat in the barn on Tuesday evenings learning things that saved them money they did not have to spend. Men who had simply known him and thought it was worth the drive. Marcus stood at the front of the church and did not try to say everything there was to say. He said his father believed that a broken machine was a puzzle waiting to be solved, and that the first step was believing it could be solved, and that the second step was learning the skills to prove it. He said his grandfather had taught his father that, and his father had taught him, and that somewhere before his grandfather there was a German blacksmith in Alma who had known things about metal that most men never learned, and the knowing had moved forward through time the way good things do not in newspapers or ceremonies, but in hands and patience, and the willingness to try something that everyone else said could not be done. He said, my father never charged enough. That was the one argument Norma never won. People laughed. Then the church was quiet. Today, farmland in Nebraska averages more than $4,000 an acre in the River Valley counties and higher in the best ground. Young farmers face the same arithmetic that Calvin Reese faced in 1971, the pressure to finance equipment that costs more than it should, to owe money to banks for machines that depreciate from the day they leave the lot, to believe that new is better and that old is liability. The numbers have changed. The choice has not. If you know a young farmer being told that his equipment is past its service life before it actually is, share this story with him. If you know someone being pressured to replace something they could learn to fix, share it. Subscribe for more stories about the men and women who built this country by knowing what they owned and refusing to be talked out of it. And tell me in the comments, what is the oldest piece of equipment you are still running, and what did it take to keep it alive? Maintenance costs less than payments. Knowledge weighs less than debt. And a machine you understand is always worth more than a machine that owns you.